The 2,000-year-old legend of Jesus has reached the whole world, from Alaska to New Zealand, from Russia to Chile. But many believe Jesus never actually existed. That belief is known as the Christ myth theory. According to Wikipedia, it's the hypothesis that Jesus of Nazareth never existed, or if he did, he had nothing to do with the founding of Christianity and the accounts in the Gospels. The beginning of this theory can be traced to 18th century France with the works of Volney and Dupuy, who argued that Jesus was a mythical character and Christianity an amalgamation of various ancient mythologies. Bruno Bauer later argued that Jesus had not existed and based his argument on 3 points. Number 1, the Gospels were written many decades or even a century after Jesus' estimated year of death. Number 2, there are no surviving historic records about Jesus of Nazareth from any non-Jewish author until the 2nd century. And number 3, certain gospel stories are similar to those of dying and rising gods such as Horus, Prometheus, Osiris, Buddha, and Krishna. In 1836, Godfrey Higgins argued that the mythology of the Hindus, Jews, and Greeks are the same at the foundation. The radical Dutch school in the 1880s believed the New Testament was not written until the 2nd century CE. In 1900, John Robertson wrote that a possible source for the Christian myth may have been the Talmudic story of the executed Jesus Pandera, which dates to 100 BC. In 1909, John Remsburg argued that the historical Jesus existed, but the Christ of Christianity was a mythological creation. He also compiled a list of 42 writers who lived and wrote during that time or within a century, who he thought should have written about Jesus but did not. In 2014, that list was increased to 126 writers during Jesus' time who allegedly did not write about him. John Allegro in 1970 argued that early Christianity originated and centered around the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms, and George Wells, who has been writing books on the subject for the past 4 decades, wrote in 2000 that his present standpoint is that the complex of traditions about a non-existent figure is not all post-Pauline and not all mythical. He says what is authentic in the material refers to the person who is not identified with the dying and rising Christ. In 1963, Alvin Kuhn wrote that the Gospels are symbolic and misunderstood by the Church. Thomas Thompson wrote recently that the accounts of both King David and Jesus are mythical and based on other ancient literature. And former Baptist minister Robert Price believes that Christianity is a historicized synthesis of mainly Egyptian, Jewish, and Greek mythologies. The Washington Post ran this article in December 2014 entitled, "Did Historical Jesus Really Exist? The Evidence Just Doesn't Add Up." The author says the first problem we encounter when trying to discover more about the historical Jesus is the lack of early sources. The earliest sources, compiled decades after the alleged events, all stem from Christian authors eager to promote Christianity. The authors of the Gospels fail to name themselves, describe their qualifications, or show any criticism, and there are no eyewitness or contemporary accounts. Little can be gleaned from the few non-biblical sources, with only Roman scholar Josephus and historian Tacitus, and even those sparse accounts are shrouded in controversy with disagreements over which parts have obviously been changed by Christian scribes, and the fact that both were born after Jesus allegedly died. This is a common argument that focuses on the lack of written material and the controversy surrounding the writings that did survive. However, the lack of written material does not prove that Jesus did not exist. This is a list of some of the libraries that were purposely destroyed by humans over the past 2,000 years, and does not include the libraries that were destroyed by natural disasters. The fact is, it is possible that there were many non-biblical writings about Jesus that were either purposely destroyed or confiscated by the Roman Empire. So an argument that focuses on the lack of writings available to the public does not prove that Jesus did not exist. Instead, it raises the question of why the writings about Jesus are so sparse, and the answer may be that the bulk of them were destroyed or are simply not publicly available. I'm not citing this as proof that Jesus existed. I'm simply pointing out that the lack of writings available to us does not prove he did not exist, because there are other feasible explanations for the missing writings. After all, the Roman Empire did rule in that area for 2,000 years, and if they wanted the evidence about Jesus changed, erased, or hidden, they could have accomplished that easily within their 2,000-year domination. Live Science ran an article in July of 2013 citing the Dead Sea Scrolls as evidence for Jesus' existence. They cite the mention of the teacher of righteousness in the text. According to Wikipedia, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered between 1946 and 1956 in 11 caves in the West Bank and were dated between 600 BC and 318 CE. Apparently, 40% of the scrolls are copies of texts from the Hebrew Bible, 30% of them are texts that were not canonized in the Bible, such as the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, etc., and the remaining 30% are sectarian manuscripts that were previously unknown. The passage in the Damascus document says, quote, God raised for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart, unquote. The exact identity of the teacher of righteousness is unknown, but many scholars have theorized about it. A Dominican priest, Jerome Murphy O'Connor, proposed that the teacher of righteousness was a high priest, and later archaeologist Robert Eisenman presented evidence that Jesus' brother James was a teacher of righteousness. Eisenman, a professor of archaeology at Cal State, claims that the group of scholars who worked first on the Dead Sea Scrolls led them to date the non-biblical documents to the Maccabean period, but instead he says the documents were more likely written during the Herodian era from 35 BC to 70 CE. So the Dead Sea Scrolls mention of a teacher of righteousness may be a reference to Jesus or someone else. No one knows for sure who the teacher of righteousness was, but some have speculated it was a high priest or Jesus' brother James. According to Wikipedia, there are 3 non-biblical passages that are used to support the historicity of Jesus, and they are found in the writings of historians Josephus and Tacitus. The first passages Wikipedia cites is in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93 AD in books 18 and 20. Book 18 is here on Wikisource, and in chapter 3 it says, Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. According to Wiki, the general scholarly view is that this passage is not entirely authentic, but few have doubted the passage in Antiquities 20 is genuine. Antiquities 20 is also on Wikisource, and in chapter 9 it says, And now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea as procurator, but the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Onanus, who is also himself called Onanus. Now the report goes that this eldest Onanus proved a most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who had all performed the office of a high priest to God, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. But this younger Onanus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When therefore Onanus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road, so he assembled the Sanhedrim of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king Agrippa, desiring him to send to Onanus that he should act so no more, for that what he had already done was not to be justified. Nay, some of them also went to meet Albinus, as he was upon his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Onanus to assemble a Sanhedrim without his consent. Whereupon Albinus complied with what they had said, and wrote in anger to Onanus, and threatened that he would bring him to punishment for what he had done. On which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him when he had ruled but 3 months, and made Jesus, the son of Domnius, high priest. So according to Josephus, all 5 of Onanus' sons were high priests, and someone named Jesus became high priest after Onanus. Those are the 2 sources that Wikipedia mentions in the books of Josephus, and a third is in the book of Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman senator and historian who lived from 56 to 117 CE. In the book of Tacitus, the Annals, book 15, It says Nero inflicted tortures on a class called Christians. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and a mischievous superstition again broke out not only in Judea but even in Rome. Those are the 3 non-biblical sources referencing Jesus according to Wikipedia. But I found another mention of someone named Jesus in Josephus' Wars of the Jews, Book 6, Chapter 5. Josephus served as a translator for the Romans during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE when the temple was destroyed. He provided a first-hand account of that event in this document, and it's on BibleStudyTools.com. In this section, he says the Romans were burning the city and a great multitude fled. Then he says, there was then a great number of false prophets suborned by the tyrants to impose upon the people that they should wait for deliverance from God, and this was in order to keep them from deserting. Thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, while they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident, but like men infatuated without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. Thus there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion, and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were come in great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread on the 8th day of the month, Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. At the same festival also a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass, and vastly heavy, and had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was therefore made of one entire stone, was seen to be opened of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. Now those that kept watch in the temple came hereupon running to the captain of the temple, and told him of it, who then came up thither, and not without great difficulty was able to shut the gate again. This also appeared to the vulgar to be a very happy prodigy, as if God did thereby open them the gate of happiness. But the men of learning understood it, that the security of their holy house was dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate was opened for the advantage of their enemies. So these publicly declared that the signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Besides these, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sun-setting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding the cities. Moreover, at that feast which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that in the first place they felt a quaking, and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." But what is still more terrible, there was one Jesus, the son of Ananus, a plebeian and a husbandman, who 4 years before the war began, and at a time when the city was in very great peace and prosperity, came to that feast whereon it is our custom for everyone to make tabernacles to God in the temple, began on a sudden to cry aloud, quote, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, and a voice against the whole people," unquote. This was his cry as he went about by day and by night in all the lanes of the city. However, certain of the most eminent among the populace had great indignation at this dire cry of his, and took up the man and gave him a great number of severe stripes. Yet did not he either say anything for himself or anything peculiar to those that chastised him, but still went on with the same words which he cried before. Hereupon our rulers, supposing, as the case proved to be, that this was a sort of divine fury in the man, brought him to the Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare. Yet he did not make any supplication for himself, nor shed any tears, but turned his voice to the most lamentable tone possible at every stroke of the whip, his answer was, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." And when Albinus asked him who he was, and whence he came, and why he uttered such words, he made no manner of reply to what he said, but still did not leave off his melancholy ditty, till Albinus took him to be a madman and dismissed him. Now during all the time that passed before the war began, this man did not go near any of the citizens, nor was seen by them while he said so, but he every day uttered these lamentable words, as if it were his premeditated vow, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." Nor did he give ill words to any of those that beat him every day, nor good words to those that gave him food, but this was his reply to all men, and indeed no other than a melancholy presage of what was to come. This cry of his was the loudest at the festivals, and he continued this ditty for 7 years and 5 months, without growing hoarse or being tired therewith, until the very time that he saw his presage in earnest fulfilled in our siege, when it ceased. For as he was going round upon the wall, he cried out with his utmost force, "Woe, woe to the city again, and to the people, and to the holy house." And just as he added at the last, "Woe, woe to myself also," there came a stone out of one of the engines and smote him and killed him immediately, and as he was uttering the very same presages, he gave up the ghost. This occurred in 70 CE at the siege of Jerusalem, when the temple was destroyed. It was the first event on Jesus' timeline in Matthew 24, and the first of 3 watches. I find it surprising that Wikipedia mentioned the other 2 passages by Josephus, but left this one out, which clearly references someone named Jesus who died in the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, who was warning about the siege 7 years before it happened. They probably don't mention it because the biblical texts say Jesus died when Pontius Pilate was governor, but notice that the Jesus in this section of Josephus' writings was listed as the son of Ananus, and in the other section he said all 5 of Ananus' sons were high priests, and someone named Jesus became high priest after Ananus. I find it very strange that no one has noticed this or thought it worth mentioning. We know history is written by the victors, and I think these discrepancies in Josephus' work are worth examining. These non-biblical texts give us a basic timeline. First, the Dead Sea Scrolls mention a teacher of righteousness, and they are dated between 600 BC to 318 CE. Next, we're told all 5 of Ananus' sons were high priests. This is a list of the high priests of Israel, and I've highlighted 6 priests with the last name of Ananus. Eleazar ben Ananus' reign started in the year 16 CE, and Ananus ben Ananus reigned in 63 CE. So the Ananus high priest reigned from 16 CE until 63 CE. Josephus said Jesus, son of Domnius, became high priest after Ananus. But in another section of Josephus' writings, he said Jesus, son of Ananus, died at the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Then Tacitus said someone named Christus suffered at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate ruled as prefect of Judea from 26 to 36 CE. This is when Christus suffered, according to historian Tacitus. Next, we have the writings of Paul, which are dated roughly between 50 and 57 CE. The Gospels of Jesus were written afterward roughly between 50 and 110 CE, usually believed to have been written after the Pauline epistles. And although it's rarely mentioned, there is archaeological evidence of a crucifixion of a man in Jerusalem that is dated to the same time period the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. The crucified man was identified as Johann ben Ha-Gagol, and the remains have been dated to between 7 and 70 AD. The name was allegedly the Hebrew inscription that was found on the tomb. It read, Jehohanan, the son of Hakol. The remains include the heel of the foot with a nail driven through it. Now we have a basic preliminary timeline based on the evidence. According to Josephus, there was a high priest named Jesus who became priest after Ananus. The Ananus priests reigned from 16 to 63 CE. Tacitus said Christus suffered at the hands of Pontius Pilate, which was somewhere between 26 and 36 CE, and that, he said, gave rise to superstition in both Judea and Rome. 2,000 years later, Paul's writings do mention the crucifixion of Jesus the Christ in passing, but not in the extreme detail mentioned in the later Gospels. It is possible that some or all of these writings were edited later and the discrepancies in Josephus' work indicates he may have been under pressure to sway his portrayal of certain events in favor of the Roman government. Was it really Ananias who stoned Jesus' brother James, or the Roman army? According to Josephus, Ananias also had a son named Jesus who was warning about the siege of Jerusalem 7 years before it happened, and he was brutally whipped and then died at the siege, which occurred in 70 CE. There is also archaeological evidence that a man was crucified at the same time, and the Gospels were written, according to most scholars, either 20 years before the siege, during the siege, or 40 years after. No one questions whether the Romans were brutal or whether innocents suffered and died by the empire. They question whether the events described in the Gospels literally occurred. This is not a complete examination of all the evidence, it only scratches the surface. But it seems there are 3 possibilities concerning the existence of Jesus. Either number 1, the Bible is 100% literally true, and Jesus was born from a virgin, brought the dead back to life, turned water into wine, walked on water, and was killed but came back to life. Or number 2, a man named Jesus existed but his story changed over 2,000 years. Or number 3, a man named Jesus never existed at all. As for the first point, anyone who has read the Bible extensively, especially the book of Revelation, will probably testify that the Bible is not 100% literal. It's full of symbolism. So the first point is not true. The Bible is not 100% literal. Also, apparently the story of the virgin birth stems partially from Buddhism. The history of Buddhism allegedly goes back almost 6 centuries before Christianity. It was known through the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and according to Wiki, Buddhism became the official religion of the Eastern Greek successor kingdoms after Alexander. Saint Jerome in the 4th century CE mentions the birth of the Buddha, who he says was born from the side of a virgin. So again, the first point is not correct any way you look at it. The Bible is not 100% literal. Much of it is symbolic, and some of it we know includes mythology and/or stories from other cultures. Another example is the story of the flood, which is also found in earlier Babylonian and Sumerian literature. As for the third point, we know it's not true that no one named Jesus existed at that time, because we've already read at least 3 references in Josephus' works of a person named Jesus, one who was the son of Ananias who died at the hands of the Romans. And there was also the story of Jesus Pandera, who was executed around 100 BC. So it seems there were at least 2 to 3 people named Jesus who died at the hands of the Romans 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem, and probably more. So the third point is obviously not true. Number 2 then is the most probable, that a man named Jesus existed and was killed by the Roman Empire, but his story changed over 2,000 years. According to Wikipedia, most scholars now agree that Jesus existed, but beyond that there is disagreement. However, one thing that does seem clearly evident is the depictions of Jesus' appearance have dramatically changed over the millennia. According to Wikipedia, the conventional image of Jesus did not become established until the 6th century CE. No physical description of Jesus is contained in any of the canonized Gospels. The book of Revelation makes reference to a vision of one like unto the Son of Man. His head and hairs were white like wool, his eyes were as a flame of fire, his feet like unto fine brass, and his countenance was as the sun shineth. But this sounds a lot like the Ancient of Days in the book of Daniel. It says, the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. Then it says the Son of Man came to the Ancient of Days. So if this translation is correct, then the Son of Man is different from the Ancient of Days, which would mean the reference in Revelation does not refer to Jesus, but to someone like the Son of Man, just as it says. And that is apparently the only reference in the Bible that comes close to describing the appearance of someone like the Son of Man. Wikipedia goes on to point out that one of the 10 commandments is not to make any graven image, so Jewish depictions of the 1st century individuals were scarce. But that changed in the 3rd century. Artwork was found on the walls of a synagogue in Dura Europos, Syria in 1932, and was dated to 244 CE by the Aramaic inscription. Among them is apparently the oldest known image of Jesus. It's called the Healing of the Paralytic. This is another picture of it from Yale University Art Gallery taken from the Yale French excavations in 1932. This is a closer view of the oldest known portrait of Jesus. This is another portrait from the 3rd century in the catacombs of Rome. This is one from the 4th century, late 4th century, 6th century, 11th century, 12th century, 1580, a painting by Rembrandt in 1648, another from 1723, a Chinese depiction of Jesus from 1879, and these are a few recent portraits. You can see the stark contrast between the recent depictions and the first known image. Since the images of Jesus have changed so dramatically in the past 2,000 years, then it stands to reason that the story may have changed as well. However, none of this negates the fact that the ancient texts that were compiled into the Bible have been accurately predicting the future for centuries. The Gospels lay out a timeline that starts in 70 CE and ends with the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds. They tell us there will be 3 watches, first for Jerusalem surrounded by armies, second for the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not, and third for the abomination of desolation standing in the hallowed place. In order to understand what the abomination of desolation is, the Gospels referred us to the ancient book of Daniel. The book of Daniel was quoted by the Sibylline oracles and was popular at Qumran, suggesting it was well known by the 2nd century BC. Yet it gave a detailed description of political events leading up to the setting up of the Dome of the Rock in 685 CE, which was the abomination of desolation that stood where it ought not on the Jerusalem Temple Mount. Not only that, it gave us the precise number of years between the first siege of Jerusalem in 606 BC until the Dome of the Rock was set up in 685 CE. This accurate prediction is expounded upon in the book of Revelation, which described a celestial configuration of stars and planets that occurred during the building of the Dome of the Rock. Revelation is believed by scholars to have been written around 95 CE. Even if one does not agree with that dating, 2 manuscripts of the Bible exist in both the Vatican and British Library, which are dated to around 330 CE. And that is still prior to the building of the Dome of the Rock. Even if the Roman Empire built the dome in order to fulfill the prophecy, how did they determine the celestial configuration described in Revelation 12, including the prominent galaxy in the center of the Virgo cluster, which is described by scientists as a halo, and was not discovered until 1781? The New Testament was first printed 200 years before its discovery in 1516. The book of Revelation describes it as a crown and was clearly written long before its discovery. Also, how did the book of Daniel know a kingdom of fierce countenance would rise out of the Roman Empire that would rule the whole world and destroy by peace? How did the authors of Revelation and Daniel know this world government would be the 8th phase from the Greek Empire and rise at the end of the 4th kingdom Greece was split into after Alexander the Great? That didn't happen until 1920. How did the book of Daniel predict the exact year of the birth and first year of presidency of Obama, the man many would call Messiah? How did it predict the exact number of days between his taking of the oath and the setting up of the One World Trade Center? The Gospels told us to watch for that 3rd event. Revelation told us the celestial configuration would also occur in the sky at that time, and it did. How did Daniel know a war in the sky would occur, World War II, and at the end of it, the Anointed One would become an accuser? These are only a few examples of the many recent and accurate predictions made by the biblical text that can now be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But its structure is similar to a mathematical equation in the sense that in order to fully recognize the validity of it, it is necessary to study the material. Yes, much of the Bible is symbolic, and it is a fact that it has accurately predicted the future in precise detail. In this context, it doesn't matter whether Jesus really walked on water or not. What matters right now is that these accurate texts seem to be telling us an asteroid is going to hit the Earth either in 2015, 2016, or between 2017 and 2024. And it also says most people will not listen to the warning or care. I have no religious agenda, and I say this not to influence your beliefs, but to raise awareness that the events predicted in these texts are occurring with precision, and we are in a very significant time period right now. The texts say many people will have dreams that come true in the time before the asteroid, and there is ample proof that is happening now. The The texts also say the Elohim will rescue a huge number of people that cannot even be counted when the asteroid hits. I have no preconceived notions about what the ultimate conclusion will be concerning these texts. My only focus is to discover the truth about what is occurring and share it with you. For more information, see my playlist Bible's Countdown to the Asteroid or my playlist Proof the Visions Come True.